Ooh. Strings finally came in, made from this cool new material. What's up everybody, AJ from Knights of the Apex. Grab a seat and a cool drink because we are going to be doing a bow build today. Going to be a little bit of a longer video. And guess what? If you want to support the channel and you need something to keep your drink cool, we have these fancy new BrüMate koozies. These are slim koozies to keep your slim cans cool. So if you want to hide the fact that you actually enjoy White Claws or Corona Seltzers or whatever fizzy fruity drink you have, pick one of these up, support the channel. Or if you just want to keep your Kill Cliff Red Bull, whatever else you drink in a skinny can, pick one of these up too. Enough self-promotion. Bow builds. So you just saw in the intro that I received some strings from Addiction Custom Archery Addiction, whatever. But they sent me some strings. I was actually contacted by Bloodline Fibers to do some photos and some promo stuff for their new string material that they have coming out. At the time I'm filming this, this actually wasn't released yet, so I will, when you're seeing this, it is going to be available on the market. I met a couple of their guys at the ATA show back in January. They reached out to me, they said, we like your content, would you like to do some photos and videos and whatnot for our new product that's coming out. They didn't really give me a lot of specifics what the product is, but I figured it would be a good opportunity to flex some creative muscle and just do something cool and interesting with a new company. And the glow in the dark, in case you didn't notice that from the pictures. See? Kinda. I don't have any previous experience with either Bloodline Fibers or Addiction Custom Strings, so this is my first experience with them, so I can't speak to their durability or longevity or anything like this. You guys may all recognize that bow as Todd of the Coda Crew. That's his VXR 28. The strings he was running on there before were actually gas bowstrings. They were the high octane strings. Nothing wrong with those strings. It's just that when Bloodline contacted me and they told me the colors that the strings were going to be running and they wanted some promo shots done, I knew that that bow would be the bow to put those strings on, just because the color combination it kind of worked. It fit exactly what they were looking to do. So, but nothing wrong with the gas strings that were on there. The zebra strings that were on there before, like all zebra strings, are useless pieces of shit. But anyway, let's get into this bow build. Keep in mind as I go through this, right, this is my particular step-by-step. The exact chronological order of the steps I'm about to go through may vary slightly depending on the make and manufacturer and what exactly I'm doing to the bow that I'm working on. Like everything else in archery, everybody's got their own little unique twists and take on things. So, you know, I would encourage you to not just watch this video and start plinking with your own bow, but also watch other videos out there from people that you trust, that you know how to set up bows, and see how they do it as well, and kind of try incorporating and experimenting with all of those different techniques to figure out what works best for you and your particular setup. The first thing you want to do is make sure when you're setting up your press, it's important to make sure that the arms on your press are applying equal pressure to each limb. It doesn't have to be exact. There's no scientific way of doing this. You just don't want them to be way off, because when it comes to swapping out the cables on the Mathews, you're going to have to remove the axles. And when you remove and replace those axles, you don't want those limbs to be in different positions, because the holes won't be lined up and you can actually damage your limb when you go to put that axle back in. Once your bow is in the press, you want to apply enough turns that the string goes slack, and then you can go ahead and remove your bowstrings and start swapping out your cables. I completely remove my bowstring because it just gives me more room to work and less things to fumble, get tangled up with when I'm replacing my cables. And I do like to replace my cables first. I also keep all of my old strings. I'll hang on to them. I'll put them in my bow bag or my bow box as a backup, just in case I'm on the road, I'm traveling, something happens. It always pays to have a backup set of strings, just in case you nick something. A lot of times you can just swap out that one cable or one string, check your timing and your zero, and then keep going. You don't have to worry about anything. So it's nice having that little peace of mind. Always hang on to your old strings. Now, as I alluded to earlier, when swapping out the cables on a Mathews, you need to remove the axles in order to replace the split yokes. The yokes actually wrap around the cams have modules on them that the yokes fit onto. So the only way to get the cams out and the strings on is to actually remove the axles and the cam. Now, Mathews makes it a little easier than most companies to remove their axles because they actually use an Allen screw to keep their axles in place, as opposed to virtually every other company on the market right now, which uses E-clips to keep their axles in place. But that being said, still be delicate when working with these Allen screws. Make sure your keys are seated all the way into the screw head, because with moderate to heavy use, you can easily strip the heads of these screws. You might also find that depending on how tight the servings are, that you need to remove the roller guide in order to get your cables through the roller guide on your riser. Swapping out the cables is pretty easy. I just go one at a time. I'll swap out the split yoke first and then swap out the cable. I'll do one and then the other. Once my cables are swapped out, I'll go ahead and replace any parts that I had to disassemble throughout that build process. I'll then put my string on. And once that's all said and done, I will drop my peep in just as a placeholder. I won't tie it in yet, but I'll take some of the pressure off of the bow, let the strings kind of settle, and let my peep settle just a little bit so the strings get used to having tension on them again. Now, as I'm releasing pressure on my strings, I like to hold my bowstring up just so it's holding everything nice and tight. As I'm releasing pressure on the press, I'm looking to make sure that all of my strings and my cables are seated where they should be and they're following the channels that they need to be. You don't want to come to full draw or put your bow in a draw board and find that one of your cables is actually off of the cam tracks, because it could have devastating consequences, or you could actually damage those strings and cables. I will then check my knock fit before going any further. Knock fit is one of those things that gets overlooked by, I wouldn't even be able to venture a guess how many people, but it's something that can have a drastic impact on your overall accuracy. The way I test knock fit is very simple. I'll knock an arrow, or in this case it's a little practice arrow. I will try to slide it up and down. It should be able to slide freely. I will then twist it back and forth. It should be able to twist freely without twisting my string. That's another reason I like to drop my peep in, is because I can actually see if my peep is twisting left or right when I twist the arrow. That's an indicator that my knock fit is too tight. Finally, I will try and pull that arrow off. Now, when I click the arrow on and off the string, I should get a positive click, but it shouldn't take a lot of pressure to remove that arrow from the string. Now, with a lot of aftermarket strings, I've found that, especially with Easton X-Knocks, that my knock fit is too tight and I have to go to a smaller diameter serving on those strings. Usually 0.018 diameter serving in a BCY material. I haven't messed around with the Bloodline material, but they are sending me some serving in different diameters to mess with. But if a 0.018 diameter in the BCY material will work with most aftermarket strings. Sometimes I have to play with running a string under the serving or not. I'm not going to cover serving techniques in this video, simply because I don't really have anything to add to other quality videos that are out there. I would actually point you guys to John Dudley and Levi Morgan. Both have great videos discussing different serving techniques, and what I do is actually a combination of both of those guys. So I will just point you guys to those videos. Those guys that are really good at serving find that a lot of times they may have to redo their center serving 2 or 3 times before they really get that knock fit and serving right. So don't get frustrated if you find that you do have to do that. It's much better to invest the time into proper knock fit and center serving now than deal with frustration with serving separation and knock travel and all of that down the line. Okay, so cables are replaced, strings replaced, center serving's good to go, knock fit is good to go. Now what I'm going to do is move on to the steps that I need to take to check my cam timing and make sure that everything on my bow is in spec. What I'll do now is I will actually tie a temporary D-loop where I plan to actually have my D-loop on these Mathews bows and my PSE as well. It's very simple. The old school method was always to set your nock height. You would at first set your rest and then your nock height so that your arrow ran through the top half of your burger buttonhole. That is a more old school way of doing it with bows that didn't have symmetrical cams back in the day and didn't have a riser design that allows you to, or was designed to shoot the arrow through the middle of the bow. On the Mathews and the PSE that I'm working on now on my personal bow, which is the PSE NXT, those bows use symmetrical cams and they're designed so that the arrow actually fires through the direct center of the riser. So setting the nocking point is actually quite simple. All I'll do is I will measure the length of string that is exposed between my two cams. I will then mark the center of that with a silver Sharpie, and that will be where my nock is going to go. From there, later on, you'll see that I'll set up my rest so that it makes a 90-degree angle, so that my arrow makes a 90-degree angle with the string. And on these Mathews bows, it's even easier if you're using an Integrate Ultra Rest, because if your nocking point is in the center of your string, your Integrate Ultra Rest, if you set it up correctly with the hash marks provided in the riser, it'll actually just be zeroed out. And 9 times out of 10, you'll find that that's either going to be a perfect bullet hole for you, or you only need very minor micro adjustments in order to get a bullet hole once you go to paper tune. And I'll show you guys that later on. But setting up that center nocking point, very easy. The reason you want it to fire down the center is because that's going to be the most efficient spot for that arrow to release. Think about it. You've got two cams, they're both twisting the same or rotating the same amount. You want to be pulling from the direct center of there, because that's going to give you the least amount of nock travel and the most efficient nock travel and the most consistent release point each and every time that you shoot the bow. With Hoyts and Bowtechs, depending on the models, because their cams have kind of varied over the years, it's a little different, and it may, depending on your model, it might be better to just go off that old burger button method, but I know with the PSEs and the Mathews, this works each and every time, and it's just a much simpler process. So I've got my temporary D-loop tied. I'm going to remove the bow from the press, and I'm going to check my axle to axle length and my peak draw weight. Now, some guys will also check their brace height. I've found with parallel limb bow designs like the Mathews, like the PSE, like the Hoyts, if your axle to axle and your peak draw weights are within spec, your brace height is always going to be in spec as well. No need to really fuss over that. So I'll first check my axle to axle, make sure that that's within specs, and each manufacturer has different specifications as far as like what are the thresholds of acceptable variance. For some reason, and this is very common with a lot of the Mathews that I've worked on, with some of the aftermarket strings and even with the zebra strings, I found that you have to add additional twists in order to get to that advertised peak holding weight. If my axle to axle and my peak draw weight are within spec, I will then move on, throw my bow in the draw board, and I will check my cam timing. Now with Mathews, on this particular bow, I'm going to be running a Integrate Ultra Rest, or I should say Todd is going to be running an Integrate Ultra Rest. So what I'm looking for here is, normally I would want my cams to hit at, they would hit their cable stops at exactly the same time. With an Integrate Ultra Rest, because that rest cord is actually going to be applying some pressure to that down cable, if my top cam is hitting slightly before my bottom cam, that's okay for right now. I just want it relatively close, and I'll get more into that later on in this video. But normally, right, if you're running a limb-driven rest, you just want to make sure that those cams are hitting at the same time. And if they're not, you just have to add or remove twists to those cables until they start hitting at the same time. A lot of bows now give you a good starting point. For instance, these Mathews actually have timing marks on the cams themselves. They're those little circles. Now they're rough estimates. They're not exact timing marks, but at least you know if your cables are running through the center of those timing marks on the cams that you're within a couple of twists of being in proper timing. On the PSEs, there's actually a little dimple on each cam, and those timing marks I found are extremely precise. If you're hitting those timing marks on those cams, if those cables are running right down the middle of those timing marks, your cams are in time. So really cool on them. I'm not sure if the recent model Hoyts and Bowtex have timing marks on their cams or limbs. I know that the older, like going back 2-3 years, the Hoyts back then did not. We used to actually mark on the cams using a Sharpie. You create your own timing marks just to make sure in travel that nothing stretched or came out of spec. But I'm not sure if the new ones do or not. Now, once I've confirmed everything is in spec and properly timed, I will actually tie in my nocking point, which will be my final nocking point. So I will just nock an arrow right where I had that little Sharpie mark. On the Mathews, I will tie a single nocking point below my arrow nock. I'm just going to do a double over-under knot. I'll do 3 knots top and bottom in rotation. I actually took this technique from John Dudley. He does this in all of his bow builds. He's got videos of it on the Nock On website as well. The reason for the double over and under knots is simply that the double knot is typically the same diameter as the bowstring, so it makes a nice square knot and consistent surface area underneath the arrow nock for when you pull back. As far as 1 nocking point versus 2, I've just found on Mathews bows going to 2 nocking points a lot of times will give you too much nock pinch, which is why I only do the single knock underneath the single nocking tied nocking point underneath the arrow nock. A good way to test nock pinch is to simply tie your nocking point, tie your D-loop, nock an arrow without any point weight in it. So nock an arrow with no field point or broadhead in it, draw back. If that arrow is fluttering, kind of bouncing on that arrow rest, then you're dealing with too much nock pinch and you want to either remove the top tied nocking point if you have one, or create a little bit of space, retie your D-loop and leave a little space at the top so that you're not pinching that nock, because that also will have an impact on your arrow flight and consistency and accuracy. After my nocking point is tied in, what I'll actually do is I will move my peep to the desired height before tying in my D-loop, and I'll explain that in a second. But for Todd, I have it written down the height that he likes his peep on this Mathews over his nocking point. So I'll actually go off the nocking point and move the peep to the desired height. And then as far as tying in the peep, all I do is I actually just do an over and under knot on the peep itself. I don't do any knots above or below it, simply because I've found that more often than not over time those knots separate apart, but even when they do, I've yet to lose a peep or fire one out. So to me, the goal of tying in your peep is so you don't lose your peep. I've yet to lose a peep tying it in this way, so for me, adding any additional knots or material to the string is just adding unnecessary material to the string, so I just don't. That's how I do it, but you know, you're not wrong if you tie in your peep any other way. As long as your peep doesn't move, that's what you're looking for. I've yet to have an issue tying in a peep this way. A lot of target archers tie in their peeps this way, and with heavy poundage bows like this, there's so much tension on that string that it would really take a lot of force to pull that peep out of the string, and at that point, you're probably going to have other issues besides just your peep being pulled out. So I will mark the peep position with that silver Sharpie. I'll mark both the top and bottom. That way, if for some reason it does shift or move, I can at least get it relatively back close to where it was before, and then I can just sight in with an arrow or two. So I will do that. Now, once my peep is in the height that it should be, you may find that just based on where the peep kind of sits on the string that you need to add or remove twists in order to get that peep to sit at a position where you can actually see it with your eye and it's not twisted at some sort of angle. General rule of thumb is every half turn to your bowstring is 90 degrees of turn in your peep. So if your peep is facing off to the left, you want to either, depending on how your bowstring is twisted, you want to either add or remove a half a turn to your bowstring. Now, certain bowstrings, it's normal for some all strings, right, have a certain break-in period to them, so it's something that you may need to monitor as you paper tune and as you break it in. Personally, having dealt with different string manufacturers, I find that, you know, if I want my strings and cables, they should settle within about a dozen shots. If it's anything more than that, that's to the point where I'm starting to get a little annoyed with that string company. But some manufacturers, they have no break-in period at all, and they just do a really good job of pre-stretching their strings. So I will add those twists before I tie my D-loop, because I want that peep to be in the right position when I tie my D-loop. That way when I pull back on my D-loop, I don't need to twist that string or that peep at all. I've seen a lot of people at the range and elsewhere where, you know, their peep is turned, so what they'll do is they'll either twist their peep twist their peep into position with their hand, or they'll twist their D-loop with their hand. And that doesn't really solve the fundamental issue, which is you need to add or remove twist to your bowstring. And actually by twisting your peep, usually when you pull back, it's going to be back to the position that it was before you messed with it anyway. And if you move your D loop, you can actually loosen up or unravel some of your center serving, which could cause serving separation, and it could actually cause your knock position to move. So you don't want to be yanking on that D loop left or right. D loops are designed, the way the knots are, to just be pulled back. They're not designed to be twisted left or right. So you want to avoid that as much as possible. One last step I almost forgot to cover is setting up your string stop. All you're going to do is you're going to loosen up the screw or screws on the Mathews case that add tension to your string stop bar. You want to loosen it up so that this can slide freely, and then all you're going to do is actually just tilt your bow. That way the string stop is resting on your bow string. You want just enough pressure so the string is barely resting on the stop, like so, but you don't want any more pressure than that, because that can actually affect your the release point of your knock. So just like that, you're good to go. And then tighten back down. Okay, so we're almost ready to paper tune. Now, I'll remove my bow from the press once again, and I'll check my rest position just to make sure it's in the correct spot. How I set everything up is I want everything running right down the middle. Your rest is zeroed out. Then I will adjust my left to right. What I will do is I will lift the whale tail of the arrow rest, knock an arrow, and I will look down from the top of the bow and make sure that the tip of my arrow is running directly in line with my limb bolt and my cams and my bow string, right? That ensures that everything is running directly down the center. After that is done, I will actually throw the bow back in the press. I kind of mess this up a little. So at some point, I would normally throw my arrow rest cord for my integrate rest into my bowstring, into the down cable actually. So with these integrate rests, right, there is a little line right here that matches up with the line on this little thumb peg. What I've found is it's not enough to have tension. It's not good enough to have just enough tension so that those lines line up. You actually have to have some additional tension on this cord, because this cord works kind of like a seatbelt, right? So you have to pull on it, and then you have to release the tension very fast in order to get it to drop. If you don't put enough tension or release it with enough speed, that rest arm just will not go down. And if it doesn't go down, you're going to get contact with your vanes, and you'll know, because this is a metal arm, you're going to strip those vanes right off of your arrow in most cases. So what you need to do is you actually need to pull, this cable has to have enough tension so that it pulls it almost beyond the little mark. And the way I do that is I will just I kind of skipped this step earlier, but I will put the bow in the press, put enough tension so that I can run the rest cord through my down cable. I will just move it up to where the serving ends, tie a little fisherman's knot, right, just so it keeps it in place. I'll then move the arm into the up position. I'll remove any tension on the set screw that's in there so that this cord can go freely. I'll make sure it's nice and tight. I will then knock an arrow, pull back, let down. From there, right, that should have pulled the necessary slack, right? From here, what I'll do is I'll actually from this end, I'll pull the cord just a little bit between probably 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch of slack. I'll actually take out of the line, and then I'll set that set screw down. That'll give me enough tension to ensure that my rest drops soon enough. Now, after I do that, I'm gonna throw the bow back in my draw board and make sure that my cam timing is still good to go. Reason being, the tension created by this rest cord will actually throw off the timing of my cams if I didn't have it set up properly. So there's advantages and disadvantages to this system, right? Very easy to set up as far as like screwing it onto the bow and making sure everything's lined up. A little bit more to think about when it comes to cam timing and making sure that your rest is working properly. That's one of the reasons I actually prefer a limb-driven rest. A lot of people will say, well, with that extra cable running to the bottom, I could get that caught when I'm walking into my stand. All right, well, dude, if you're catching your rest cord, and here, let me use my PSC as an example. If you're catching this rest cord, right, you're probably catching your bowstring and your cables on stuff as you're walking in too. The difference is if you catch a limb-driven rest cord and for some reason that cord becomes damaged or unusable, all you have to do is run a new cord from the rest to your limb and you're good to go, right? Whereas with a cable-driven rest, if something happens to that rest cord, your cam timing could be off, your rest may not operate because it's not in the proper position. There's a lot more things that can actually go wrong when something does go wrong with a cable-driven rest versus a limb-driven rest. Typically, right? That's not true of all designs, but with this hamski like I run right here, I actually just, here, let me remove the equalizer so I can show you guys. But when installing a hamski rest like I have on my PSC NXT, I'll do the Dudley method. This isn't an NTN model, so what I'll do is I'll actually just tie a little fisherman's knot, run it between the eyelet and my down cable, and then, or actually this is my up cable, and then I would just loop it through my hamski, and I'll actually just tie a prusik knot just like you would find on your safety line of your tree stand rope, right? That way that allows me that I can actually add or remove tension on here with just my hand. I don't need any tools. So if I need to paper tune this thing or I want to just check where everything's kind of lined up, right? For whatever reason, I need to lift my rest cord, I can do that without any tools. And then if I need to, when it comes time to set this thing back up to shoot, I can just pull down on it and move my knot down. It's kind of an awkward thing, but it is convenient and I don't have to use tools. I thought I was somewhat of an innovator doing this, and then Aaron Snyder actually told me that he's been doing this for well over a decade. So there goes that. I thought I was making a name for myself in the industry, but someone's always had the idea before you. So limb-driven system, in my opinion, just a little bit of a simpler system to set up and run, and a little bit less maintenance, and on my end, a little bit more peace of mind. But that being said, these QADs are extremely lightweight and they're in line, so it does create a more natural kind of ergonomics of the overall bow and does help keep the weight down. And honestly, once you set them up, you can kind of forget them. I had an Integrate Ultra Rest on my Verdicts last year, had thousands of arrows through that bow. Once it was set up, I never had to adjust it again. It was just a great rest. So just some things to take into consideration when choosing rests and setting up rests. Now you're ready to paper tune, right? A lot of people dread paper tuning for some reason. I used to be one of you. If you followed all of the steps that I outlined, and this is why I set up bows this way, because I found if you follow these steps in kind of the more or less the order that I've laid them out, paper tuning tends to be a very simple process. Now, when you go to paper tune, the biggest issue that I find a lot of people have is their grip actually is not as fundamentally sound as they think it is. A lot of people have a habit of torquing their bow one way or another, and just because your grip looks textbook doesn't mean it's actually having the desired effect on your bow, and you could actually be torquing your bow without realizing it. A very simple way to check if you're torquing your bow is simply to come to full draw and then glance up at your top cam, and your bowstring should be running directly down the center of your top cam. If you can see that string sitting to the left or right of that cam channel, then you're torquing your bow and you have to adjust your grip until that string runs down the center. And you should be adjusting your grip in a way that you can then make that repeatable, because that's how you should be shooting that bow each and every way. And that's something to really take into consideration when you're choosing a bow that a lot of people do not. They just say, oh, this grip feels very comfortable. Okay, well, comfort should be secondary to effectiveness. Is it the grip? The grip might be comfortable, but if you're torquing that grip and your arrow's shooting out at a 45-degree angle from the riser, you're not getting the full efficiency of that bow. So just take that into account before you go to paper tune. Check, make sure that your bow grip is actually correct and you're not torquing that bow. Now, assuming you're gripping your bow properly, go to paper tune. Now, this bow, ironically enough, probably because I had set it up before, this was a bullet hole first time out. Rarely is it ever that perfect, but this thing did shoot perfect bullet holes. You can see, I'll throw up screenshots of shots where I purposely torqued the bow to the left and to the right, and you can see the different tears that creates. And that's why it's so vital to have a consistent and effective bow grip every time you shoot, because that little bit of variation can have a drastic impact on arrow flight and the efficiency of that bow, or the efficiency of that arrow leaving that bow. Now, I've set up Mathews, PSEs, and Hoyts in a lot of them in the method that I just described to all of you. What I've found is, when I come to paper tune, the only thing I should really have to adjust, if I followed all of these steps correctly, is micro adjustments to my left or right, up and down, in order to get bullet holes. If I find that I'm getting a hard tear or an erratic tear more often than not means I'm getting some sort of clearance issues. So I'll check my veins, see if there's any damage there, check my rest, my cables, make sure that my veins aren't coming into contact with any of those things, because usually that's what's going to create an erratic tear. If it's not clearance issues, I will try and tune the up and down out of that tear first, and then move on to my left and right. Simply because usually it's easier to diagnose and correct that up and down than it is the left or right. Once that up and down is kind of tuned out, if I'm getting an erratic left or right tear, 9 times out of 10, I have to, if it's a Mathews, swap out the top hat spacers and the cams. Usually if I just swap out the bottom spacers, that will correct any hard left to right tear that I'm facing, and then I just have to do maybe some small micro tune to the rest after that. With the PSE, I was actually able to correct some of the tearing I was having by adjusting the cable guard. It is an adjustable cable guard, so I imagine that would also work similarly on other bows. I know, speaking to some people that have the NTN bows that has a locked cable guard system, they did have to mess around with the spacers on the cams in order to get their bows to shoot bullet holes. But I don't know, I can't say for certain that there wasn't some, user error or grip or anything in that. So, but just something to keep in mind. With Hoyts, if I'm getting an erratic tear, or if I'm getting a hard left or right tear, that means that I have to add or remove twists to the yokes on there. And if you have a bow that has yokes, that'll usually be the case as well. 9 times out of 10, that will square everything away. If that still doesn't solve the issues and you're starting to get frustrated, walk away for the night, right? Come back the next day, go through the process step by step. Usually there was something overlooked or missed or a step skipped, and that's the reason that the bow's not tuning. But if you go through this step-by-step process, I found that in most instances with most bows, this is just a very efficient, very simple way to set up and tune a bow and swap out strings and cables. That's it, guys. That's a bow build for you. After that, you're ready to go sight in. is a video unto itself, but that is a basic bow build for you. Thank you for watching. Really hope this helps somebody. Drop a comment below. Let me know what you think. Are there any additional steps that you take when setting up a bow that you find helpful? Is there anything that I covered that you would like covered in more depth, different camera angles, anything like that? Let me know. Appreciate the feedback. Put this out to help all of you. Yeah, everybody, enjoy working on your stuff. Thanks for tuning in, and stay safe. Hope you guys are shooting. See ya.